Have you ever wondered what truths about the Apache Wars were deliberately buried so deep that even historians refuse to speak about them? What horrors were considered too disturbing to include in any textbook, any museum, any official record? Before we unveil what was erased from history, I need you to do something for me. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this story needs to reach every corner of the world. Then, please subscribe to this channel. We desperately need your help to keep bringing these hidden truths to light. The forces that buried these records don't want you to know what really happened. Your subscription is an act of resistance against historical erasure. In the spring of 1873, a routine excavation at Fort Bowie in southeastern Arizona uncovered something that would send shockwaves through the highest levels of military command. What began as a simple construction project to expand the ammunition storage would become the doorway to one of the most closely guarded secrets in American military history. Private James Whitmore, a 22-year-old engineer from Massachusetts, was the first to break through into the chamber. According to his sealed testimony, which remained classified until 2008, what he found was not the remains of old supply caches or forgotten equipment. It was a network of underground cells that should never have existed. The official records from Fort Bowie mention nothing of significance from that spring. The construction logs show a 2-week delay attributed to structural complications and unforeseen geological formations. But the truth, buried in unmarked files at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, tells a different story. On April 19, 1873, at approximately 3:45 in the afternoon, Private Whitmore descended into a series of chambers carved directly into the rock beneath the fort. The walls bore markings, not in English or Spanish, but in what appeared to be a corrupted form of Apache pictographs, mixed with symbols that matched no known Native American language system. Colonel Marcus Haywood, the commanding officer of Fort Bowie at that time, immediately ordered the site sealed. His personal journal, discovered by his great-grandson in 1996, contained entries that were never meant for public consumption. On April 21, 1873, he wrote words that would haunt anyone who read them. What we found beneath the parade ground cannot be reconciled with any known military operation. The implements, the restraints, the documentation in those sealed containers, they speak to something far more organized than battlefield necessity. Captain Reynolds believes we have uncovered evidence of a program, something systematic. Captain Thomas Reynolds, the fort's intelligence officer, began a clandestine investigation that would consume the last months of his life. Reynolds, originally from Virginia, had served in various conflicts and was known for his meticulous documentation. His encrypted correspondence with contacts at the War Department in Washington revealed growing alarm. In a letter dated May 7, 1873, he wrote in code that was only deciphered in 2012, "The chamber contains records of experiments that extend back to at least 1864. Names, dates, methodologies. What disturbs me most is the notation system. It suggests observation over extended periods, sometimes years. These were not prisoners of war. They were subjects. Ors. The Apache Wars had officially begun in 1849 and would continue in various phases until Geronimo's final surrender in 1886. But what Private Whitmore discovered suggested another war entirely. One fought in the shadows. One that had different objectives than territorial control or cultural suppression. Among the items recovered from the underground complex were 12 leather-bound ledgers, each containing detailed entries in multiple hands. The entries were clinical, detached, describing procedures and outcomes with the emotional resonance of agricultural reports. Subject A7 exhibited heightened resistance to sensory deprivation, after 48 hours. Subject C-12 demonstrated unexpected linguistic adaptation when exposed to compound isolation protocols. Subject F-23 expired during the fourth iteration of the stress exposure sequence. Dr. Harold Kemper, a military physician stationed at Fort Bowie from 1870 to 1874, left behind letters to his sister in Pennsylvania that were donated to a historical society in 1928. The letters sat unread in storage until a graduate student stumbled upon them in 2003. In a letter dated June 15, 1873, Kemper wrote with barely concealed distress, "Dear Margaret, I cannot discuss my duties here in detail, but know that I have been asked to participate in activities that violate every oath I took when I became a doctor. When I objected, I was reminded that during wartime, different rules apply. They showed me authorizations from Washington bearing signatures I recognized. I am trapped, Margaret. What they are doing here, what they have been doing for years, it is not interrogation. It is something else entirely. Something that assumes these people are not people at all." The evidence suggested that Fort Bowie was not an isolated case. Cross-referencing military transfer records, supply requisitions, and personnel assignments from the period revealed a pattern. Fort Apache, Fort Grant, Camp Lowell, Fort Thomas, and Fort McDowell all showed similar anomalies in their official documentation: unexplained construction projects, gaps in supply records, medical personnel with backgrounds in experimental psychology and neurology, officers transferred suddenly with their records sealed under national security protocols that should not have existed in the 1870s. Sarah Chen, a forensic historian at Georgetown University, spent 7 years piecing together the network. Her dissertation, completed in 2015, was immediately classified by the Department of Defense under a rarely invoked statute from the Homeland Security Act. Chen fought the classification, and portions of her research eventually emerged through Freedom of Information Act requests, though heavily redacted. What remained readable was damning enough. The systematic nature of the operation suggests central planning and coordination, the movement of specific personnel, the uniformity of record-keeping, the parallel construction projects across 7 military installations. All of this indicates a program with clear objectives and substantial resources: the designation system for subjects, the classification of procedures, the reporting hierarchy. These are not the hallmarks of rogue officers acting independently. This was policy. In the underground chambers at Fort Bowie, investigators found something that would become the subject of intense debate for decades. Among the medical instruments, the restraint systems, and the documentation, there were photographs. Not official military photographs, but images captured with care and precision, showing progression over time. The photographs depicted Apache individuals, but their eyes told stories that no caption could convey. Dead eyes, broken eyes. Eyes that had seen something that shattered them from within. The photographs were arranged in sequence, showing the same individuals over periods of weeks or months. The transformation was unmistakable. Whatever happened in those chambers changed people at a fundamental level. Lieutenant Robert Morrison, assigned to the investigation team in 1873, wrote in his confidential report to General George Crook, "The photographs suggest a deliberate process of psychological deterioration. The subjects show progressive loss of affect, decreased responsiveness to external stimuli, and what our medical consultants describe as induced dissociative states. The question that haunts us is not whether this was intentional, the documentation makes that clear, but rather who authorized it and to what end." General Crook, one of the most prominent military figures in the Apache Wars, kept private journals that were sealed by his family, until 2001. When historians finally gained access, they found entries that complicated the accepted narrative of the conflicts. On August 3, 1873, Crook wrote, "I have been made aware of activities conducted at certain installations under my nominal command. I was not consulted, nor was my approval sought. When I demanded answers, I was told that certain research initiatives fell outside standard military protocols and reported to different authorities. I pressed further and was warned, politely but firmly, that continued inquiry would be detrimental to my career and potentially to my safety. I am a general in the United States Army, and I am being threatened by men in civilian clothing who refuse to identify their department or authority." The implications were staggering. If Crook, the commanding general responsible for much of the Apache campaign, was deliberately kept ignorant of these operations, then who was running them? The answer, pieced together through decades of research, pointed to a shadow network within the military and civilian government. Personnel files showed a core group of officers and officials who rotated through the southwestern forts, always arriving quietly, always leaving with their records sealed. Dr. Edmund Cartwright, Dr. Helena Vasquez, Colonel Richard Stoughton, Captain William Thorne. These names appeared again and again, connected to medical transfers, psychological research, and what internal memos referred to as behavioral modification protocols. Dr. Helena Vasquez, one of the first female physicians in military service, left behind a trunk of materials that her descendants discovered in 2009. Among her personal effects were research notes that detailed experiments in sensory deprivation, forced language acquisition, and what she termed cultural dissolution techniques. In one chilling passage, dated October 10, 1874, she wrote, "We are attempting to determine whether identity itself can be systematically deconstructed and reconstructed. The Apache subjects provide an ideal test population due to their strong cultural cohesion and documented psychological resilience. If we can break that cohesion, if we can fragment their sense of collective identity and replace it with something else, we will have developed a tool of extraordinary power. Not just for this conflict, but for future applications wherever populations resist assimilation." The methods described in the recovered documents were sophisticated for their time, drawing on emerging theories from European psychology and incorporating techniques that would not become widely known until the mid-20th century. Isolation protocols designed to induce temporal disorientation, forced witnessing of cultural destruction without physical contact, systematic severing of social bonds through carefully orchestrated scenarios, chemical compounds derived from regional plants, administered to enhance suggestibility or suppress resistance. The documentation was extensive, detailed, and utterly devoid of ethical consideration. Private testimonies from soldiers who served at these installations began to surface in the 1980s and 90s, as veterans or their families came forward with stories they had been ordered never to tell. Marcus Teller, who served at Fort Grant in 1875, recorded a video interview in 1993, shortly before his death at age 97. In the interview, housed at the Smithsonian but restricted from public viewing, Teller described his role as a guard at what he called the underground section. His words were halting, heavy with decades of suppressed memory. "We were told they were the worst of the worst. Hostiles who could never be reformed, never be trusted. We were told we were protecting civilized society. But I saw them. I saw what was done. They would come up changed, broken. Some of them couldn't speak anymore, not in English or Apache or anything. They would just stare. And then they would be released, sent back to their people. I didn't understand why until later. They were messages. living messages sent back to break the spirit of those who remained free. This strategy, if the testimonies and documents were to be believed, represented a form of psychological warfare far ahead of its time. By returning traumatized individuals to their communities, the architects of these programs created vectors of despair and terror. The returned individuals carried with them not just their own trauma, but questions that could never be answered. What happened to them? Where were they taken? What did they endure? The lack of answers, the visible evidence of profound suffering, the clear message that capture meant something worse than death, all of this eroded morale and spread fear through the Apache populations. But the discovery at Fort Bowie suggested something even more disturbing. Among the documents recovered were references to collection sites and processing centers that extended far beyond the main military installations. Remote locations in the Dragoon Mountains, the Chiricahua Range, the Huachuca Highlands. Coordinates and descriptions that led investigators to caves and abandoned structures where evidence of human habitation, human suffering, remained visible decades later. Restraint systems carved into rock walls, drainage channels cut into stone floors, pictographs that mixed Apache symbols with others that suggested the presence of observers recording the proceedings. In 1997, a team from the University of Arizona conducted an archaeological survey of a site in the Dragoon Mountains identified in one of the recovered documents. What they found was classified immediately. Team leader Dr. Patricia Moreno fought the classification for years and eventually published a sanitized version of her findings in 2004. Even in the redacted form, her conclusions were shocking. The site shows evidence of sustained human activity from approximately 1868 to 1882. The modifications to the natural cave system are consistent with the creation of containment and observation facilities. The presence of human remains, though incomplete and scattered, suggests that not all subjects survived the procedures described in the documentation. Carbon dating and bone analysis indicate at least 37 distinct individuals were present at this site over the 14-year period. The causes of death cannot be determined from the degraded remains, but the physical evidence of restraint, the modifications to the skeletal structure consistent with prolonged immobilization, these findings align with the procedures detailed in the Fort Bowie documents. The numbers became a point of grim fascination for researchers. If 37 individuals could be documented at a single remote site, and if multiple sites existed across the territory, then how many people had been subjected to these programs? The official casualty figures for the Apache Wars counted deaths in combat, deaths from disease, deaths during forced relocations. But nowhere in the official records was there accounting for those who disappeared into these shadow facilities. Census records from Apache reservations in the 1880s showed unexplained population shortfalls. Families listed in earlier documents simply vanished from later ones with no notation of death, relocation, or escape. The gaps in the records suggested hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individuals whose fates were deliberately obscured. Captain William Thorne, one of the recurring names in the Shadow Network, left behind a sealed confession that was not discovered until 2016. The confession, written in 1912 when Thorne was dying from cancer, was hidden in a safe deposit box at a bank in Denver. His instructions were that it should not be opened until 50 years after his death. Thorne died in 1913, but due to administrative confusion, the box remained sealed until a routine audit triggered its discovery. The contents were immediately seized by federal authorities, but not before a bank employee made a copy. That copy eventually reached journalists who published excerpts in 2017. Thorne's words provided the clearest picture yet of the program's true scope and purpose. We believed we were conducting a great experiment in social engineering. We believed that we could demonstrate that any population, no matter how resistant, could be fundamentally altered through the application of scientific principles. The Apache were chosen not because they were uniquely savage or dangerous, though that was the justification provided to the public. They were chosen because they represented the strongest test case. If we could break them, if we could remake them, then our methods could be applied anywhere, to anyone. That was the real war. Not for land or resources, but for the future. A future where resistance itself could be eliminated at the source, where populations could be managed not through force alone, but through the systematic destruction of the very capacity to resist. The revelation that the Apache Wars served as a testing ground for techniques of mass psychological manipulation sent shockwaves through academic and governmental circles. Congressional inquiries were quietly initiated and quietly shut down. Descendants of Apache survivors filed lawsuits demanding full disclosure and reparations. The Department of Defense maintained that the documents were largely exaggerated, that any programs that may have existed were limited in scope and not officially sanctioned. But the evidence continued to accumulate. More installations were identified. More remote sites were discovered. More testimonies emerged from descendants who had heard whispered stories from grandparents who had survived. In 2019, a former intelligence analyst named David Brewster came forward with what he claimed were additional classified documents from the 1950s. Brewster had worked at the Defense Intelligence Agency from 1987 to 2005. According to his testimony, he was assigned to a project reviewing historical military operations for potential security implications. During that review, he encountered a series of files marked with unusual classification codes that predated the modern system. When he inquired about these files, he was told they related to experimental programs from the late 19th century that had been reactivated during the Cold War. The implications were staggering. If Brewster's account was accurate, then the techniques developed during the Apache Wars had not been abandoned or forgotten. They had been refined, expanded, and applied in new contexts. Brewster provided copies of documents to investigative journalists before disappearing in February 2020. His location remains unknown. The documents he released contained references to Protocol Apache and Program Chiricahua, code names for psychological operations that drew directly from the methodologies documented in the Fort Bowie materials. One memo, dated May 6, 1953, discussed applying lessons learned from Southwestern tribal pacification programs to contemporary insurgency challenges. Another document, from 1968, detailed training programs for intelligence operatives that included study of historical behavioral modification successes, with specific reference to the Apache campaigns. The connection between past and present raised disturbing questions. How much of modern psychological warfare, modern interrogation techniques, modern population control strategies could be traced back to those underground chambers in Arizona? How many of the methods that the United States and other governments had employed throughout the 20th century had their origins in the systematic brutalization of Apache prisoners in the 1870s and 80s? The official silence on these questions was deafening. Dr. Samuel Vance, a psychiatrist who worked with Native American communities for 40 years, published a controversial paper in 2021 that attempted to document the intergenerational trauma caused by these programs. His research, based on thousands of hours of interviews with Apache families, suggested that the psychological damage inflicted during the Shadow War had echoed through the generations. He identified patterns of dissociation, hypervigilance, and profound distrust of authority that could not be explained solely by the documented hardships of reservation life or the general trauma of colonization. These patterns, he argued, were consistent with the specific types of psychological torture described in the recovered documents. What was done to these people, Vance wrote, was an attempt to destroy not just individuals, but the very possibility of cultural continuity. The trauma was designed to be transmitted, to infect families and communities, to create a legacy of brokenness that would persist long after the perpetrators were dead. The Fort Bowie site itself became a point of contention. In 2007, the National Park Service, which manages the Fort Bowie National Historic Site, received pressure from Apache tribal councils to conduct a comprehensive archaeological survey of the underground areas. The Park Service initially agreed, but the project was cancelled without explanation in 2008. Unofficial reports suggested that the Department of Defense had intervened, citing national security concerns related to ongoing operations. What ongoing operations in 2008 could be threatened by the excavation of chambers from the 1870s? The question was never satisfactorily answered. Local residents near the old fort reported strange occurrences in the decades following the initial discovery. Security personnel appearing without explanation, conducting surveys and taking samples. Access roads to certain areas being quietly upgraded. Motion sensors and cameras installed in remote locations. The official explanation was that these were standard measures to protect archaeological resources and prevent looting. But the level of security seemed disproportionate, especially in areas that contained no documented ruins or artifacts of particular value. It was as if someone, some organization, was still very interested in what lay beneath the Arizona desert, still monitoring, still protecting secrets that were supposedly a century and a half old. In the summer of 2022, a hiker named Michael Torres stumbled upon something in the Chiricahua Mountains that reignited the entire controversy. Torres, an experienced outdoorsman from Tucson, was exploring an unmapped section of the range when he discovered an entrance to a cave system that did not appear on any geological survey. Inside, he found what appeared to be the remains of a facility, metal fixtures embedded in stone walls, drainage systems too precisely engineered to be natural, and scratched into the rock, barely visible beneath layers of mineral deposits, were markings, pictographs showing figures in restraints, symbols that matched those photographed at Fort Bowie nearly 150 years earlier. Torres documented everything with his phone before the battery died. When he returned 3 days later with better equipment and a friend, the entrance had been sealed with what appeared to be recent concrete work. Fresh tire tracks led away from the site. Torres filed a report with the Forest Service, which was forwarded to the FBI. He never received a response. But 2 weeks after his discovery, his home was broken into. Nothing of value was taken. Only his computer, his external hard drives, and his camera equipment were missing. The Torres incident followed a pattern that investigators had documented over the previous 2 decades. Anyone who got too close to certain sites, who asked too many questions, who possessed physical evidence that could not be easily dismissed, experienced consequences. Not dramatic consequences that would attract attention, but subtle ones. Job losses attributed to budget cuts. Denied permits for research projects. Equipment failures at critical moments. Dang An disappearing from archives before researchers could examine them. Witnesses recanting testimonies or becoming suddenly unavailable for interviews. It was the signature of an organization that had decades of experience making problems disappear quietly. Professor Janet Okoye of Stanford University had been researching the connection between the Apache programs and later government projects for 12 years when she vanished in 2023. Her car was found abandoned near the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. Her laptop and research materials were gone. The official investigation concluded she had likely become disoriented and succumbed to exposure, though her body was never found. Her colleagues knew better. Okoye had been in contact with a source she identified only as The archivist, someone inside the defense establishment who had been leaking documents to her for months. The last email Okoye sent, recovered from her university account, was chilling. The archivist sent something that changes everything. It's not just historical. They never stopped. The programs evolved, but the core methodology remained. I'm meeting the source tomorrow to get physical copies. If something happens to me, tell everyone that the Shadow War never ended. The documents Okoye had been receiving, partially reconstructed from her email exchanges with colleagues, suggested that the techniques developed during the Apache Wars had been continuously refined and applied throughout American history. The same core group of families, institutions, and shadow networks appeared again and again in different contexts. Personnel connected to the Apache programs showed up in the Philippines during the insurrection, in Haiti during the occupation, in Guatemala during the coups, in Vietnam during the Phoenix program, in Iraq during the insurgency, in Afghanistan during the occupation. The names changed, the organizations evolved, but the methodology remained consistent. Identify resistant populations, isolate individuals, apply systematic psychological destruction, return them to their communities as vectors of despair. Dr. Thomas Whitehorse, an Apache historian and activist, had been fighting for full disclosure for 30 years when he agreed to an interview in 2024. Whitehorse, whose grandfather had survived the reservation period, spoke with the weight of generational knowledge. My grandfather would have nightmares until the day he died. He would wake up screaming words in Apache and English, and sometimes in languages that weren't either one. My grandmother told me that he came back from somewhere different from other men. He had been taken, she said, taken by men in uniforms to a place under the earth. He never spoke of what happened there, not directly. But she said he would sometimes talk in his sleep about things that couldn't be real, about machines that made sounds that broke your mind, about being shown images of your own people being destroyed while you were restrained and could do nothing, about injections that made you forget who you were. My grandmother said that when he finally came back to the reservation, he was like a ghost. He looked like her husband, but the man inside was different, hollowed out. And she said she wasn't alone in this experience. There were others, many others, who came back changed. The elders whispered about it, but never spoke openly. They were afraid that speaking would bring the men in uniforms back. The implications of Whitehorse's testimony aligned with what the recovered documents suggested. The programs were designed not just to destroy individuals, but to use them as weapons against their own communities. The trauma they carried, the visible evidence of their suffering, the mystery of what had been done to them, all of this served to demoralize and terrify those who remained free. It was psychological warfare of the most insidious kind, turning the victims themselves into agents of terror and despair. In 2025, a group of investigative journalists working for a major publication began compiling what they called the Apache Project, a comprehensive investigation into the Shadow War and its modern legacy. The team included reporters, researchers, and data analysts who spent 18 months gathering evidence, interviewing sources, and attempting to map the full scope of the programs. They identified 93 potential sites across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. They documented connections between historical personnel and modern institutions. They traced funding through layers of military budgets, classified programs, and private contractors. They were preparing to publish when their editor received a visit from two men who identified themselves as representatives from the Department of Homeland Security. The visitors carried documentation that invoked national security interests and ongoing operations. They did not explicitly threaten, but they made it clear that publication would have consequences. The investigation was killed. The reporters were reassigned. The compiled evidence was turned over to federal authorities and never seen again. But copies exist. They always do. In safe deposit boxes with trusted friends, uploaded to encrypted servers, hidden in places that would only be revealed upon certain triggers. The truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful forces try to bury it. And the truth about the Apache Wars, about what really happened in those underground chambers, about the shadow war that continues to this day, that truth is fragmentary but persistent. It exists in scattered documents, in whispered testimonies, in archaeological evidence that keeps surfacing no matter how many times access is restricted. The question that haunts everyone who has looked deeply into this history is simple and terrible. If they did this then, and if they never stopped, what are they doing now? The technology has advanced exponentially. The understanding of human psychology has deepened. The tools available for mass manipulation, for the systematic destruction of resistance, for the creation of compliant populations, these tools are more sophisticated than anything Dr. Helena Vasquez or Captain William Thorne could have imagined. If their primitive methods achieved such devastating results, what could be accomplished with modern neuroscience, with artificial intelligence, with nanotechnology, with the complete surveillance apparatus of the 21st century? There are rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, of facilities that still exist. Not in the open, not on any map, but buried deep in the desert, hidden in mountain complexes, submerged beneath military installations, places where the research continues, where the methodology is refined, where test subjects are still subjected to procedures designed to break them at the most fundamental level. The evidence is circumstantial, but it accumulates. Unexplained disappearances of individuals from vulnerable populations, budget line items that don't align with any known programs, contractor payments to companies that don't seem to exist, personnel transfers that follow the same patterns as those identified in the historical documents. A particularly disturbing case emerged in 2025 when Border Patrol agents near Douglas, Arizona, found a man wandering in the desert in a state of complete dissociation. He carried no identification. He could not remember his name or where he came from. Medical examination revealed signs of prolonged sensory deprivation and exposure to unknown chemical compounds. His body showed marks consistent with restraint systems described in the historical documents. Brain scans revealed unusual patterns of activity that neurologists described as artificially induced trauma signatures. The man was placed in a mental health facility where he slowly began to recover fragments of memory. He spoke of being taken from a homeless encampment in Tucson. He remembered a facility underground, though he could not say where. He described procedures that matched those from the Fort Bowie ledgers with disturbing precision. Before investigators could learn more, the man disappeared from the facility. Security footage from that night showed a deliberate systems failure. The man was never found. His case file was sealed by federal order. Similar cases appeared sporadically across the Southwest. Individuals found in various states of psychological destruction, bearing the hallmarks of systematic torture and mind control experimentation. Each time, the cases would begin to attract attention, and then they would be shut down. Files sealed, witnesses becoming uncooperative, evidence disappearing. The pattern was consistent and damning. Someone with substantial resources and authority was still conducting these programs, still refining the methods first developed in those chambers beneath Fort Bowie, still using human beings as raw material for experiments in breaking and remaking consciousness. The technological advances of the 21st century provided tools that the architects of the original programs could only have dreamed of. transcranial magnetic stimulation, optogenetics, neurochemical manipulation at the molecular level, artificial intelligence systems capable of modeling and predicting psychological responses. The combination of these technologies with the methodological framework developed during the Apache Wars created possibilities that were truly terrifying. The ability to not just break a person's will, but to restructure their entire personality, to delete memories and install new ones, to eliminate the very capacity for resistance at the neurological level. Documents from the manifest leaks described research into what was called identity substrate manipulation. The theory was that identity itself, the sense of self that each person carries, could be treated as a programmable system. If you understood the underlying architecture, the theory went, you could rewrite it. You could take a person who was resistant, rebellious, ungovernable, and transform them into someone compliant, obedient, and unable to even conceive of resistance. The documents included progress reports from test subjects, clinical descriptions of procedures, and outcome assessments. The language was sterile, scientific, completely divorced from the reality of human suffering it described. Subject Delta 7 shows complete identity restructuring after 6 weeks of Protocol 18. Subject Gamma 12 exhibits no recall of previous belief systems and has fully integrated assigned behavioral parameters. Subject Epsilon 3 achieved terminal compliance threshold after 8 iterations of cognitive reset procedures. These were not historical documents from the 1870s. These were dated from the last 5 years. If they were authentic, and many experts believed they were, then the Shadow War had achieved a level of sophistication that made the original Apache programs look primitive by comparison. The implications were beyond disturbing. If this level of control was possible, if human consciousness itself could be hacked and reprogrammed, then what hope was there for freedom? What resistance was even possible against an enemy that could reach inside your mind and change who you fundamentally were? In April 2026, a whistleblower who called himself Manifest began posting encrypted files to dark web forums. The files contained what appeared to be current operational documents from a program codenamed Legacy Chiricahua. The documents described facilities, protocols, and objectives that were chillingly similar to those from the 1870s. But instead of Apache prisoners, the subjects were described only as non-compliant elements from resistant demographic clusters. The methodologies had been updated with terms like neural disruption protocols, identity fragmentation sequences, and behavioral compliance optimization. But beneath the modern terminology, the core approach remained the same: isolation, psychological destruction, return to point of origin as a vector of despair. Manifest posted dozens of files over a 2-month period before falling silent. Efforts to verify the authenticity of the documents have been inconclusive. Intelligence agencies claim they are elaborate fakes, but experts who have examined them note that the level of detail, the consistency of the classification systems, the specificity of the protocols, all of this would be extraordinarily difficult to fabricate. The Apache descendants who have fought for recognition and justice have faced obstacles at every turn. Lawsuits demanding disclosure have been dismissed on national security grounds. Requests for excavation of documented sites have been denied. Attempts to access classified files have been blocked. The message is clear. There are secrets that will not be revealed. Not now. Perhaps not ever. But the families persist. They organize, they document, they refuse to let the memory die. Because they understand something that the architects of the Shadow War always underestimated: the human spirit, the capacity for resistance, the refusal to forget. These things cannot be completely destroyed, no matter how sophisticated the methodology. Maria Delgado, an Apache elder and activist, spoke at a gathering in 2027 that brought together descendants, historians, and human rights advocates. Her words carried the weight of history and the fire of defiance. They tried to break us. They tried to erase us. They tried to turn us into weapons against ourselves. And they succeeded in causing terrible damage. But they failed in their ultimate goal. We are still here. We remember. We carry the stories of those who suffered in those dark places. We honor their memory by refusing to be silent. They want us to forget, to move on, to accept their lies about what happened. But we will not forget. We will not be silent. And we will not stop demanding the truth, no matter how long it takes, no matter what they do to try to stop us. The evidence suggests that the Shadow War never ended. It evolved. It adapted to new technologies and new enemies. But the core methodology, developed in those underground chambers beneath Fort Bowie and other installations during the Apache Wars, remained the foundation. The systematic use of psychological torture to destroy resistance, the weaponization of trauma, the creation of populations so damaged, so broken, that they could no longer imagine freedom, much less fight for it. This was the legacy of the Apache programs. This was the gift that the architects of those horrors gave to future generations of those who would seek to control and dominate. But there is another legacy, one that the oppressors never anticipated. The legacy of survival. The legacy of resistance that persists even in the face of overwhelming force. The legacy of stories that refuse to die, that pass from generation to generation, that wait for the moment when they can finally be told fully and completely. The Apache people survived the Shadow War. They survived the reservations, the forced assimilation, the cultural genocide. They survived because something in the human spirit cannot be broken, no matter how sophisticated the tools of oppression become. That something is the connection to truth, to justice, to the divine spark that exists in every person, and that no program, no matter how brutal, can completely extinguish. For those who have studied this history, for those who have traced the connections from past to present, there is a recognition that the battle continues. It is not fought with weapons, at least not openly. It is fought in the realm of information, of memory, of truth. Every document that surfaces, every testimony that is recorded, every site that is identified, these are victories in a war that most people don't even know is happening. The forces that conducted the Shadow War, that continue to conduct it in new forms, they rely on secrecy, on confusion, on the exhaustion of those who would oppose them. They count on people giving up, on the weight of evidence being too heavy to bear, on the implications being too terrible to accept. But there are those who will not give up, researchers who dedicate their lives to piecing together the truth, activists who demand justice for crimes committed generations ago and crimes that continue today, descendants who carry the trauma, but also carry the determination to ensure that what happened is never forgotten and never repeated. These people represent a different kind of power, one that the architects of control have always struggled to overcome. The power of moral witness, the power of persistent truth-telling, the power of communities that refuse to be broken. The story of the Shadow War during the Apache conflicts is not just a historical footnote. It is a warning about what humans are capable of doing to each other when they convince themselves that the end justifies any means. It is a testament to the resilience of those who survived and their descendants who continue to fight for recognition. And it is a reminder that the battle between those who would dominate and those who would be free is eternal, taking new forms in each generation, but never truly ending. If you have followed this story to its conclusion, you now carry a responsibility. The responsibility to remember, the responsibility to question, the responsibility to resist the comfortable lies that allow atrocities to continue in the shadows. The forces that conducted these programs, that continue to conduct them in evolved forms, they count on apathy and ignorance. They count on people being too busy, too distracted, too frightened to demand answers. Do not give them that gift. Ask questions. Seek truth. Stand with those who have suffered. Because the shadow war continues, and every person who awakens to that reality is another obstacle in the path of those who would control and dominate. In the end, we must turn to something greater than ourselves. The evil that was done in those underground chambers, the evil that continues in places we cannot see, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel like a darkness too deep to ever be illuminated. But there is a light that darkness cannot overcome. There is a power that no program of control, no matter how sophisticated, can defeat. That power is the love and justice of God. The recognition that every person, no matter their background or circumstance, carries the divine spark and is worthy of dignity and freedom. The understanding that Christ himself stood with the oppressed, the broken, the forgotten. When we feel overwhelmed by the weight of this history, when we feel powerless against forces so entrenched and so ruthless, we must remember that we do not fight alone. We fight with the strength that comes from faith, from the certain knowledge that justice will prevail, if not in this world, then in the next. We fight because God calls us to fight, to stand against evil, to be witnesses to truth no matter the cost. And we fight with hope, because hope is the weapon that the architects of oppression fear most. Hope that refuses to die. Hope that persists even in the darkest places. Hope that whispers, even in the underground chambers, that freedom will come, that truth will emerge, that love will conquer hate. Let us carry that hope forward. Let us honor those who suffered by refusing to forget, by demanding justice, by standing firm in our faith that God sees all, knows all, and will ultimately set all things right. May we find the strength to continue this fight, generation after generation, until the shadow war finally ends and the light of truth shines into every dark corner where evil has hidden. Amen.